Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk about diversity. We have a wonderful guest here who is actually a co-author in the book that I was a co-author in as well, Power Up Superwoman. And I actually met Sarika through the book. I did not know her before and got to read a little bit of her story through the chapter that she wrote for the book. And we have since talked and had some really great conversations around diversity and inclusion. And so I'm really excited to have her here. Sarika Bhakta, and she is I probably still butchered that. I tried my best. But she is the founder of Nicole Diversity Consulting. And she has been in executive coaching consulting for over 20 years, empowering diverse talent and population groups to maximize their leadership potential while increasing their cultural competency and global perspective. So we're going to have a really good conversation here. So Sarika, welcome, Leaders of Transformation. We're excited you're here today.
Thank you for having me, Nicole, and it's a pleasure continuing to collaborate with you.
Yes. So I want to make a note to also do a shout out to our listeners and our viewers, because you're the reason why we do this podcast. Sarika and I had great conversations. We're talking offline. It's awesome. She's sharing about how she's, making a huge impact in her community. And I wanted and asked her to come on this podcast so that she can share that with you, so that it can encourage you and inspire you to be the difference maker that you're capable of being. Maybe you're in a similar situation like Sarika, in an area where you are the diversity and you're wondering what to do with that. Or maybe you own a company or are developing a team and you want to know how to bring in more diversity. So she's going to give us some great tools in order to do that. And so afterwards, I'd love to hear how this has impacted you. Feel free to comment on our social media posts, but also you can reach out to me through the website, leadersoftransformation.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you like this episode, please give us a rating and review. It does help us to extend our reach through the podcast and so forth. So Sarika, why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit more about yourself and what you're passionate about?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you to all your wonderful listeners. You have a great podcast, and I've listened to some of your podcasts, and it is very transformational. So I'm honored to be part of one of your series here. I was born in Gujarat, India. Gujarat is a state in India by the western part, right next to Pakistan. I came to the States when I was 19 months old in the late 1970s, before technology was prevalent. So I always think about immigrants that come to America now, or immigrants that go to another country. In today's day and age with technology, going to another country is never easy. But if you don't have any technology, I always said that my parents were frozen in time. When they came to America, they brought their views, their perspectives, and they were frozen based on what they knew because they weren't connected with their mother country. And so India was moving forward, they were progressing, and my parents were here, frozen in time. And so it's really interesting when I think about being in America. We were in San Francisco, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and then ended up in the Quad Cities in Illinois. And we were one of the first Indian families in our community. And Chicago, just to give a perspective of where Quad Cities, about 2.5, 3 hours away from Chicago. And being one of the first Indian families in a community, being one of the only Indian students throughout second grade through high school, it just puts it into perspective in terms of at least diversity from a racial, ethnic perspective, how challenging and daunting that was at that time.
Yeah, so coming from India to the American Midwest, I mean,
yes,
talk about stark difference. And you're not just going to, somewhere, you're going, like, now I know you're in Iowa. And
yes,
it's interesting, you told me a story about how still there's very little diversity in Iowa. And so other Asian people, they live there and then they say there's no diversity and then they leave. And I remember you saying something to the effect of, well, if you all leave, then when is there ever going to be diversity here? Something to that effect. But, you're now working in that arena. This has kind of sparked a passion in you for diversity and inclusion, recognizing what is missing, what you talked about with your parents, but also what is missing in the community as they were starting to get to know you. You're growing up in this industry. Can you talk a little bit about that spark of how it sparked your passion?
Absolutely. Diversity is something that has always been with me. And I think that what inspired me is I want to bring the diversity pendulum back into balance. We have always looked at diversity from a racial, ethnic, and gender lens.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at Iowa, you mentioned diversity from Iowa. I know, Nicole, if I asked you, when you think of Iowa, does diversity come to top of mind for you? Iowa farming?
No, they'll all probably look like
Iowa caucuses.
maybe not so blonde.
Diversity from a racial, ethnic perspective never bubbles to the top. And what I want to do is, again, bring the pendulum back into balance. I want where when I say the word diversity, or when people hear the word diversity, they resonate with it. Whether you are white, black, brown, you resonate with it, because right now, that's where we are at. Not everyone is resonating with diversity. And until individuals start resonating it from themselves, that's going to help with the conversation. More importantly, that's going to help with that making a difference, making an impact. They need to be part of that solution so we can collectively elevate humanity. And right now, in our workplaces and in our communities, every time you say diversity, it's almost at a point where it gets to, people get diversity fatigue. They get tired of hearing it because, one, they're using it as buzzwords. Two, there may not be action around it because it's all empty. They see it on their website and the company policies and the mission vision, but it's not trickling down because they're not really quite sure, how do you leverage diversity as an asset with equitable processes, inclusive behaviors? You've got to go beyond the D&I, the diversity inclusion. I push back because we can include people, but at the end of the day, we need to gauge, are the other individual, the other parties, are they engaged? Because that's what's going to drive the innovative results in your workplace, in your community. And when you look at the high disengagement numbers that we are seeing in employees, not only domestically in America, but globally, that's the equation that we need to work on. When we see high numbers of managers that are disengaged, add that with employees that are disengaged, that's what we need to work on. Diversity is not a magic pill because everybody is different. Yeah. We need to leverage that with all the other aspects with equity, inclusion, and engagement.
Yeah, I love that what you said there is because it is a buzzword now. It's like, oh, now we're going to be focusing on diversity and inclusion. Like, we're really cool. We're good. We're good people, right? We're a good company to work for because we're working on this. But do they really understand what that means? And are people engaged in that process? What does that actually mean? The other thing you mentioned, which I think is important to emphasize, is that we're all diverse. It's like, yes. I teach personalities, and I know we were talking about this previously too. It's like I teach personality dynamics. Yes. Everybody's different. You can't categorize. People don't like to be categorized. They don't like to be pigeonholed, but they do like to be better understood. And so if we can help people to be better understood, we can start with understanding ourselves better, understanding the differences, not necessarily judging the differences, but being aware of the differences and distinctions. And then how do we work together? That's a good starting point. So even like personalities, everybody's different. So if I think that everybody should think like me, then I'm gonna have a very narrow view of the world. And absolutely. How often do we do that?
Yeah. You're right, absolutely. And that is where the diversity is. It's just differences, whether you're looking at it from a racial, ethnic, gender, political differences, religious differences, socioeconomic, geographical differences. At the end of the day, diversity is differences. And that's why I want to bring the pendulum back into balance. And right now, where you see a lot of times is that there's so much disharmony happening in the workplace cultures as well as in your communities. So a lot of times when people do come to Iowa, they'll come here and there is diversity, but from a racial ethnic perspective, they may not see that visible diversity. And so they're moving on. But I always say, what change are you making to make a difference?
Mm-hmm.
Go to LA, Chicago, New York, and yes, Nicole, I mean, everywhere we turn, diversity is right in our faces, right? That's beautiful. I use an analogy in the early 80s, we had this melting pot theory. Everybody together, and it's like a fondue, it's melted. We're all great together. But what happens when you melt everything together? Your uniqueness gets diluted, and then you become what the majority is.
Yes.
And so I don't believe in the melting pot theory. I also, there's a salad theory. And this is what I see big communities, big metro areas. You think about like a garden salad.
Mm-hmm.
With the lettuce, onions, tomatoes, olives, cheese. But if they're all layered, so increased diversity, we're also seeing increased silos. And that's what these layers are creating. You go to Chicago, you have what? Little India, little China, little Italy, which is beautiful because you step in there, you feel like you're transported into another culture, another country. But what happens when an incident happens, then suddenly the barriers come up, the perceptions are all there, there's biases that come through that can spark something like a Ferguson event or something similar to that. The reason because these communities have not been interacting with each other, they haven't been engaging with each other. And so you take from a melting pot to a layered salad to what about a tossed salad?
Mm-hmm.
Where everything is mixed together and they're not in layers, but they still have their unique identity, their cultures. But when I say culture, it's not just a racial ethnic culture, political culture, religious culture, sexual orientation culture, everything has a culture. But when you toss it together, it'll still remain together, but you're integrating, you're talking with each other.
You're not cooking it together. It's actually still raw, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that means that when an incident happens, and we know there's so many incidents that are happening around the world, that if we don't communicate with each other and if we don't expose ourselves as leaders to new groups, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're not transforming ourselves if we continue to stay in our own silos.
Right. So when you go into companies and work with them, and I know you do a lot of workshops and trainings to be able to overcome this gap and this these misconceptions and silos and so forth. So how do you do that?
Well, you mentioned one is just learning and development, just helping increase that awareness. And I always say training in itself will not get you the outcome that you want. It has to go beyond to actionable items. And that's where you have to do the groundwork of actually defining what equity means, what diversity means, what inclusion is, what engagement is, and more importantly, connecting it to that individual. It's not just about the workplace or the community, but it's the individual. The individual is a common denominator across all of these spheres. Mm-hmm. And that individual needs to resonate with this. They need to buy in to it. And everyone is on a different journey. I can look at, say, example, Iowa. We have University of Iowa. In Iowa, when you have administration, staff, faculty, and students on campus, is very, very diverse. They're global in nature. But as soon as their staff, faculty, administration, and students step out, what is the region like? Is it inclusive? Does it feel engaging to them? And so the conversations is being able to have to them is that sense of belonging. And that really does come to understanding, what does diversity mean? It's not just a policy or strategy that you need to do. It really comes from inside doing the deep work. How are you diverse? As a leader, do you want to be a cookie cutter leader, or are you a diverse leader? And do you have the cultural competency? Again, culture goes beyond racial, ethnic culture. You have the cultural competency, and can you communicate with different groups? That's where your intercultural communication skills come into play. At the end of the day, we are part of the global economy. Our backyards are different. They're changing rapidly, but globalization and technology are the key drivers of diversity. That means our workforce and our marketplace is global.
Right.
That also means that we need to hire leaders and managers that have cultural competency and intercultural communication skills. But honestly, the reality is, and Gallup, shares this, and you probably have seen the numbers. 82% of the time, this is what companies are not doing right. They're not hiring qualified candidates to be in those key managerial positions.
Right.
Nicole, that is mind-blowing when I think about it. 82% of the time,
Yeah.
80% of the time, you have individuals that are managers who have critical touch points throughout the organization.
Yeah.
That with high employee disengagement globally.
Yeah. So
That
you
is where,
so you either have to teach the ones you have, or hire and create opportunities and open opportunities for people that actually do already have it. Now, that doesn't necessarily just mean, okay, I'm going to pick culturally diverse people, because you could have somebody who's of Indian descent, if you will, and not be a diverse, be culturally competent either.
correct.
It's not just the white male.
No.
I get that that's an issue there, but there's also, so talk about how do you find the people and or develop the people. Either way, they got to develop the skills of cultural competence.
We all do.
Yeah.
We all do. We are all leaders. So when I talk about inspiring and empowering diverse leaders, for me, diverse, as I just indicated, is each and every one of us.
Right.
Leaders, we are all leaders, whether we are leaders in our home, in our community, and in our workplaces, we are leaders. And so when we're talking about cultural competency, and we're not talking about finding someone that's, again, from a racial, cultural, ethnic background. Cultural competency really comes down to being able to understand how can you integrate with individuals that have different perspectives from you, different backgrounds from you, different experiences from you.
Right.
And so a white man, an Indian woman, it doesn't matter. We all need to develop our cultural competency. And when you're looking at hiring, it's not about and that's where then you would go back to affirmative action. And if you're doing that, then we're going way, way, way back. I understand companies, especially those that need to have that in order to be in compliance and keep their doors open. But if you're just doing affirmative action and utilizing that as your equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement strategic plan, no, you're just in compliance to keep your doors open, but you're not really moving the needle further along. And so when we're talking about how can you expand your recruitment net, that's really looking at different ways of sourcing candidates. If you've traditionally just been going to a couple of key areas, but you haven't gone to other universities or other colleges or looking at associations that can bring you additional qualified candidates, that's what we're looking at when we talk about diversity recruiting, is really expanding your sourcing of candidates so you can get more qualified. At the end, you want someone that is qualified.
Right. And what I'm hearing is there's a shift in beliefs. Leaders that have this cultural competence that we're talking about have different beliefs. So can you talk about what they are? So, because you've worked with them, you've worked with leaders that have competence in this area, leaders that don't. How do they think differently? How do they believe differently? What are some of the different questions that they ask as they lead their teams?
Sure, as part of that cultural competency, that doesn't mean you lose your identity as part of it, right? And that's something that if you are able to integrate and be comfortable stepping into another room that looks so much different like you, or has a different cultural belief, or even a religious belief, or even a political belief, that means your cultural competency continues to enhance. And it's being open at the end of the day, being open and having empathy. Those are critical traits to have as part of your cultural competency. That doesn't mean you lose your authentic self, because you're just being a chameleon, and that's not what cultural competency looks like. And it is developing yourself over time. I'm continuing to develop myself as well. And that is what we're looking at. You can be a leader or you can be a global leader. And I know the term global leaders back in the days was really set aside for companies that were global and had facilities that were global, and you had global teams. But as I just indicated, our backyards are changing, our marketplace is open because of technology. We all have access to the global economy. So that means that you want to be a leader or have the global leadership skills, and part of that is that cultural competency and the intercultural communications. So I'll give you another example. When you think about Western leadership style, that seems to be what many gravitate towards. Mm-hmm. The gold standard in terms of leadership, would you say that's what is always reverted to? So strong handshake, look people in the eye. That all was part of the Western leadership level, right?
Yeah.
What about leadership styles based on communication styles from different countries?
Okay.
Not everyone has strong handshakes because that is just part of their cultural communication style. Not everybody looks someone in the eye. Does that automatically mean that they're not confident? We have always been taught, at least in the Western community, in the culture, strong handshake. If it's weak, if it's loose, you have the loose noodle, it shows that you are not confident, and people are making snap judgments just like that. So again, in a global workplace, global economy, we need to reimagine and rethink our definition of what a leader is.
Yeah, so talk about that. What are some of the different leadership styles? So what we just talked about, you just talked about some of the traditional North American beliefs around leaders. And because you've worked with different people, different parts of the world, what would that look like in India? What would a good leader look like in India? What would a good leader look like in China? What would a good leader look like in Africa? I don't know. I'm just Australia, wherever, different places of the world. How does it differ?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The definition of a leader at the end of the day is someone that can inspire a shared vision, right? Someone that's inspirational.
Yes.
And that is so, and I think that's why when I think about leadership, it is hard for me to say what a leader from a certain particular country would look like. Mm-hmm. Again, with globalization, that's why I always say, how are you different as a leader? I ask that of leaders all the time because you have all of these books on leadership and leadership styles. And a lot of times what we're seeing is people start doing the cookie cutter leadership. If there are certain things about someone that really inspired you and influenced you, it's good to ask, what traits do they have that you look to them as leaders? Sometimes you have these titles that people have as leaders, but guess what? They did not engage me. They did not motivate me. It was demoralizing. And so those leaders are the ones that's going to really empower you as an individual to give you the tools and resources. At the end of the day, you feel good about what you're doing. And for me, that's what a leader does, right? You feel engaged, excited, someone that's going to be there with you to be able to roll up their sleeves. And even if you don't know that individual, but they're making an impact and you feel so inspired. And we talked about this, I think, Nicole, is like there are some leaders. I mean, my daughter came home and she was reading about, in history about Hitler. I mean, you think about it, and we've had conversations. Hitler, he inspired a vision.
Yeah, he did.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, some people say good, some people say bad. Again, somehow, somewhere, someone like that individual inspired a vision.
Yeah, he definitely enrolled people into something. He had something that got people to follow him. Yes, absolutely. And that's, so when we look at leaders, and I guess what I'm trying to get to with this question is not necessarily the cookie cutter, but okay, so leaders who are culturally competent, they look at people's diversity, they ask different questions, they need to inspire people from different cultures,
different perspectives,
all of that. They need to inspire people that come from a wide range of backgrounds and viewpoints.
Absolutely.
How do they do that when there are certain there's going to be people that are going to believe this is what a leader is, this is what a leader is, this is what a leader is. And in the midst of all that, they need to inspire people and enroll people in a vision, engage them. And that's the biggest challenge right now, is we don't have engagement, right? Because
and exactly,
they're not being bought in by the leaders. So there's a huge gap. And the more leadership consulting that goes on, and the more, like, there's no shortage of leadership consulting going on, organizational, cultural, whatever. And yet at the same time, we still have the same problem.
You're right. And that is a reason why when I look at this industry as well, and a lot of times it was D&I. Oh, now let's put the I in front of the D, create inclusive culture so that we can retain diverse talent. Again, diverse talent is someone who leads differently, someone who manages differently, someone who learns differently, someone who comes up with different processes, right?
Right.
And then I always push back and said, well, what about engagement? I can include you, Nicole, you can include me. We've been in meetings where we've been included, but somehow, somewhere along the lines, that ambiance and that environment was not conducive for us to share our feedback, our thoughts in a way that we were able to feel as if we were contributing, right? So what happens? I know what I do. I mentally get disengaged. That's just me. And so that is why we're looking at those engagement numbers. And that engagement is so important, because there's a domino effect when people are not engaged. They're not going to be inspired by their leaders. They're not going to be inspired by themselves authentically to be leaders. Day in and day out, I hear all the time, my manager is micromanaging me. My manager is not sticking up for me. My manager is doing this. And I said, okay, what do you have in your control? You can control your own actions and reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Ask them this, because I worked in one place. It was a very hostile and toxic workplace culture. And a lot of times when you're talking about hostile workplace cultures, it may not be something that is being done to you directly, but if it's happening to a colleague and you're seeing it, it is impacting you. And that is a very hostile culture. How you thrive in that culture when you see that.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the day, you have to think about, what difference do you want to make? Can you still stay in it? And I know what I had to do. I asked for a change. I wanted to be part of that change. You asked, what's the difference maker? And you don't want to go gently into the good night. I know I don't. So I asked, put me on the management, put me on the leadership team. Although I felt like a leader because I know I'm a leader in everything that I'm doing. But sometimes in the organizational strata, those levels sometimes makes a difference, because I always say, as a leader, you need to be the buffer for the team and or the glue for the team when warranted. And when you're feeling your communications are being heard or passed on to a higher level, that's when you make that ask. You have to make that ask, and you have to ask, this is how I can help. This is how I want to make a difference. Then also be willing to follow through if you don't get that ask, though.
Yeah. So what I hear in that, even just from the examples of what people said that their managers were doing, so micromanaging, allowing people, so the flip side of that is allowing people to not micromanage them, equip them, give them the support and the tools they need, but then allow them to create the result the way that it's best for them. It doesn't matter, like, as long as we get to the result with ethically, morally, all of that, we get to that result. And then the other thing I heard is, they don't go to bat for me, is to have, and I know one of our other guests that was on the show, Julie Kratz, talked a lot about male allies, but just allies in general, allies and sponsors within organizations, and sponsoring those people, mentoring. So I'm hearing that. I'm hearing asking the feedback. You talk about feedback, is getting feedback as a leader, that that you can hear how your leadership style is translating to the people that you're leading. How do they, even just asking, like, these managers probably haven't asked, how am I doing? Most of the time, what we hear is, okay, so, managers and leaders telling people, okay, this is how you're doing. Well, what about if you were to ask, how am I doing as a leader, and flip that around, would be very powerful. So, so where do companies begin with this process of diversity inclusion? You mentioned about recruiting. but now they're not just going to fire a whole bunch of people and hire a bunch of whole new people. They got to start somewhere. So maybe give us a few steps to where they can start. Yeah, I want this to be practical for people, that they go, okay, I get the problem. What do we do about it?
Absolutely. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said, what diversity is. Everybody is diverse. You have diversity in your company right now.
Already, yeah.
People need to resonate with that. This is where I think the problem is that's where we don't get the buy-in, is because, again, diversity has been at times in some people's mind associated with certain groups. Right. And so we need to bring that back into balance a little bit and know that our company is diverse. Now, let's look at areas where we can enhance diversity.
Right.
And pinpoint it. Okay, what is it? Do we need to be looking at more from a racial, ethnic perspective? Do we need to look at it from a gender perspective? Right? So I think we need to just bring the pendulum back into balance a little bit more. Otherwise, it's not going to work, because you're going to have individuals that aren't bought into this. And it's a cultural transformation you're doing in an organization. Right. It's something that needs to be top down, up top, all the way through. It has to be embedded as part of your culture, so that, and it's not an overnight.
Yeah.
It's not overnight. It's going to be a long journey. So as part of your roadmap, you need a strategic plan.
Right.
And without a strategic plan, it's just a bunch of trainings people are doing left and right, whether they hear Starbucks had to do it, they closed shop and they provided that training, and then now everybody else is looking at providing training because they hear this happened. You don't want to be reactive. So why not take the time to be proactive on this journey and get the commitment, get the buy-in, and do this right. And so it means creating a strategic plan, creating champions, having commitment from the top that is also walking the talk, and also engaging. We always say the frozen middle, the middle managers, because sometimes they feel as they are the ones that have to maintain the status quo because they're sandwiched in the middle. And in reality, these are the crucial stakeholders that can really make it successful, or they can really, let it not make it a priority. And right now we're seeing that where 41% of managers do not make diversity a priority. So then you got to go back up to, even if leadership is committed, where did the discommunication happen that managers don't make it a priority?
Yeah, why are they not bought into it? And do they
exactly?
And I think that everyone really ultimately, when it comes right down to it, there's an element of self-preservation. There's a selfishness to it, in a sense of people ask themselves fundamental questions subconsciously: what's in it for me, and why do I care about this?
Absolutely, I would too.
And so a manager goes, oh yeah, okay, so how does that relate to me? Is that bothering me? If it is, then maybe I'll do something about it. If it isn't, then maybe I won't. Is there if there's no impact, if there's no consequence to them, why would they do something different, right? It's like one of my other guests, he talked about the brain hack. He was talking about brain hacking, and he was saying, brains are energy Scrooges. So our brains don't want to just expend energy just for the sake of expending energy. They want to know why that is, why we're going to do that. There needs to be a reason for that. So for somebody to change something, to do something different, is going to require some cognitive energy. It's going to require different levels of energy and different, emotional energy, maybe even. So why would they even do this? So there has to be that buy-in for them to even understand what's important, and then believe that it's possible. So what's in it for me? Why do I care? And then you go into, is it worth it? And can I do it? Those 4 questions that people are asking themselves all the time. And if you're not, and if they're not answering those questions, or leadership is not answering those questions, then you're going to struggle to get that frozen middle engaged, unless of course somebody like yourself says, hey, I'm in the middle, or whatever, somebody, let's say, for example, like that, who says, I want to do something about this. But that's also because you saw it occurring in the culture, something there was something you were dissatisfied with. There's a dissatisfaction that caused movement.
And you're right. Those are questions that if managers have, then we need to help address that. And at the end of the day, how is this going to make me do my job better, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it is vested and they need to be. How can I, with this, help my team be better at what they're doing? How can I support them better? How can I meet my goals and collectively meet our goals?
Yeah.
And that is where the strategic plan really comes into play, and having outcomes that are going to be meaningful and measurable to be able to drive those sustainable outcomes in the long run. And I think this is something that we see all the time, is it the right thing to do? Is it the moral thing to do? Very flowery, but at the end of the day, we really need to think about the ROI and what impact. And you know what? It's innovation. This is what diversity, inclusion, and engagement and equity in your company is going to be able to do. Right now, you have companies, I always say this, that if they don't feel the urgency, they don't feel the pinch, it's not going to move them to action.
Right.
So what is that pinch going to be? Is it going to be a lawsuit? Is it going to be a competitor that comes and totally disrupts your industry and you did not have that culture that was agile enough to be able to course correct?
Yeah.
And whatever slice of the market you have is going to start dwindling. And we also know that in this tight labor market, Nicole, what do we see? What are candidates wanting? They are looking for companies that really do put diversity as a priority. And I also challenge each and every one of us that is out there that are on the other side of the table, question those organizations and companies that you're interviewing with. What is your goals around equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement? What have been some successes? What have been some failures? Because right now we already know that, what do they say, 61% of job seekers are looking for this. And I guarantee you in 2025, I'm looking at my calendar here, 75% of our workforce globally are going to be millennials. And we know the younger generation, this is something that they
want that.
They want that.
Yeah, this has been good. So for our listeners and for our viewers, this is kind of like we're starting the conversation here. There's a lot to this. In fact, Sarika, talk about, you're actually going to start your own show.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm excited, and I
talk about diversity straight up, I think is what it's called, right?
That is correct. Diversity straight up. And what we are lacking at times is authentic conversations. From who? From C-suite executives, in the sense that a lot of times having to be politically correct, if I say something negative, I say something wrong, how is that going to be spun? We want to speak with executives in the C-suite with national and global companies. Because again, as I talked about, we're part of the global economy now.
Right.
And we're looking at leaders versus global leaders. We want to talk to C-suite execs. We want to explore not just their strategies and policies in their companies. We can get that anywhere, right? But we want to talk to them as a leader. What was their experiences around this? What were some of their pitfalls? Authenticity is needed, because I know that if you listen to someone and they're honest about their journey, you can learn from them and it makes them connect, right? So I think about companies who are not on this journey. Mm-hmm. You know, the strength in peer-to-peer. Sometimes you get inspired by peers. So, you know who's in those positions? White male execs.
Right.
Cannot alienate them. They need to be our allies, our advocates, our champions. I want to hear from those leaders what their journey was like. What changed? What were some trigger points? What were some aha moments in their professional journey where they were able to look at diversity, potentially leverage diversity as an asset versus a liability? And what their journey lead them to become global leaders and better leaders? And what were some things that triggered it for them? Because if their conversations with us on our podcast can help inspire some other C-suite exec that were kind of hesitant about going on this journey, if this exec can help inspire that, I want us to collectively start elevating humanity. And it does start with looking at what leadership has done. And, you know, you can have a leader say, you know what, we're going to go on this equity, diversity, inclusion, and engagement journey. As a leader, you can ask the team. But as a leader, if you can be raw about your experiences, and say, hey, you know what? I had pitfalls, but guess what? I got up and I brushed it off, and this is what I did. It goes a long ways. So that's what Diversity Straight Up is going to be about, is helping to inspire other C-suite execs to really make an impact in their own companies, but also help other leaders like everyone their global leadership skills.
Yeah, and it's going to come from other C-suite as opposed to coming from you as a consultant, an organizational consultant, that perhaps they see you as an alternate and a female, that female Indian descent. So it's like, well, she obviously, this is important.
Powerhouse.
So, but if they can hear it from other peers, that this is what we've done. This is what I discovered. This is where I was going. Let's say where I was doing it poorly. This is what I discovered. This is what we did, and this is what the impact has been. I think that would be very powerful. So we'll make sure that there is a link in the show notes. So for those of you that are listening, if you want to reach out and connect with what Sarika is doing, learn more about it, you can go to. It'll be on our in the show notes on leadersoftransformation.com. You can also go directly on her site at nikeyadiversity.com. That's NIKEYA diversity.com. And we'll make sure there's a link to her podcast. When it comes out, we'll add that to the show notes. And also a copy of this book. I would encourage you to get one. Power Up Superwoman. She wrote a chapter in this. Actually, there's a number of people. Amy Waninger. I just actually flipped open the page to Amy.
Yes.
Amy,
good friend.
Yeah. So she is also speaking about diversity. There's a lot of diversity. Linus Woods Mullins. I know you and I have both been on Linus's show and talking about this. So there's a lot of great, and here you are, your chapter, and so there's a lot of great stories in this book from women who have experienced challenges, overcome those challenges, and not only empowered themselves, but are empowering others through that journey. And so I'd encourage you to get a copy of that book. You can find it on Leaders of Transformation. You can, I'm sure, find it also on Sarika's website as well. I don't care where you get it, just get a copy of it and read it.
Agreed.
Encourage you to do that. So Sarika, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it. I know this was like a small taste, and there's so much more that we can unpack here, but hopefully it'll give our listeners enough curiosity and interest to be able to start the conversation of diversity and open their minds up, not be frustrated about it, not turn it off and say, oh, I've heard this a million times now, it's a buzzword, but really, what does it mean, and what does it mean to me and the people that are important to me? And it starts there. So,
It does. And thank you so much, Nicole. What a great way to end a Friday afternoon talking to you and to your listeners about these wonderful aspects of developing and transforming themselves, because it does start with themselves. And each and every one of your listeners is diverse. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And to our listeners and viewers, I always say that leaders of transformation take action. So nothing happens unless you do something with what you learn. So start asking yourself those questions. How am I diverse? How do I think differently? Because it starts with you accepting yourself and the uniqueness that you have. And then looking at your organization. If you are working within an organization, where is diversity showing up? Where is it not showing up? And what can I do about it? Rather than pointing fingers simply at leadership and saying they're not doing, what can I be doing to start to bring that in, and maybe even trying to change the conversation from the ground up as to where you're at. If you have a company, look at, and or you are a leader, look at it from the standpoint of how can we incorporate, how can we be more inclusive, how can we invite the different, thought processes, the perspectives, the diversity, because that's what we're talking about. It's not just about, checking the box on it. It's about having diverse conversations. And I don't care who you are and what kind of company you have, the more diversity of thoughts, the greater the innovation. And,
Agreed.
And so I encourage you to that. I'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com. You can find us on social media, reach out to us. And we really appreciate you being here and look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.